Today's video is going to show you how I make a bandsaw box. These are some simple one-drawer boxes that are finished on the inside as well as outside. I have a book that I use that I bought at a local bookstore that I use for patterns, and I use some of the techniques in the book, but not all of them. I hope you enjoy learning how to make a bandsaw box. I have here a bunch of scraps from other projects that I've been working on, and I'm going to use these scraps to make some bandsaw boxes. Typically what I do is find a piece that I'm going to use for the face of it. This is a piece of apple wood that's just a leftover piece I'm going to use for the face of the box. And then I just have different types of wood in here. I look at how the grain is running on the wood, and I try to make it so it contrasts each other, so it's not all facing the same way. I like to start with a flat bottom if I can, or as flat as I can as I'm gluing it up together, and it just makes it a lot easier. I have this pattern here I'm going to use. It came out of a book, which I can give you that information as well. You can copy it larger or smaller depending on what size box you want to make. And let's just get going on the process. The first thing you have to do is glue things together. All right, next you just try to get them all straight and lined up the best you can. And you start clamping them together. You got to be careful at first because they tend to move because there's so much glue. I have the bandsaw boxes, the wood for it, all glued up. So next we're going to look at making some flat surfaces on them by using the jointer before I put the patterns on. After flattening out the bottom, I'm using the miter saw to make a square edge so I have a 90-degree angle. This makes it easier to place the pattern on the box so it will be straight. What I'm doing here is just sanding the faces down, get them nice and smooth before we put the pattern on. What we're going to do here is just put this pattern on, and we're going to use some adhesive spray. And just position it on here so the bottom. The adhesive I am using is repositional. It makes it easier to get it off once you're ready to finish the wood. Here we have our block with our pattern on it. I've jointed the bottom of it and trimmed off the side to make it square. And so we're just going to use the bandsaw to cut this inside of the box drawer out. I'm using a 1/8 inch blade. I think is a 14 tooth blade, and we'll see how it goes. So here we have the drawer blank, and then we have the inside of the case cut out. What we'll do is we'll sand this out, then we'll glue it back on, and then we'll cut out the outside dimension. After using the spindle sander to sand out the inside of the case of the box, I take 120, 220, then 320 grit to smooth it out. Just a lot of sanding involved with this woodworking project. I decided I'm going to put some of this white ash as the back for the boxes. And it's pretty thin, and so that will help. You can't have it too thick this way, otherwise my spindle sander won't be tall enough to sand the profile of the outside edge once I get the back on. So we're going to use this on all the backs of the boxes. With this one, I'm just going to turn the grain the opposite way, so you'll have this up and down look on the back to contrast with the grain on the side here. So that'll be interesting. So let's get these glued up. In gluing these up, I want to be careful not to get too much glue on the inside edge here. So I don't have to worry about glue showing on the inside of the back. And it won't hurt to let it dry a little bit. When I'm clamping this up, I try to make sure I get a little bit of overhang on the bottom. And we'll just use a router trim bit to trim that even. It's important to get a clamp right here, so when the kerf of your cut to cut out the inside, make sure that's got good contact with the back. Okay, we have the back on the box, and next we're going to cut out the outside form of the box. Okay, here's the rough shape of the box. The pattern calls for cutting the center part out. I don't do that. I just prefer to leave it flat, but that's an option too. What we're going to do next is trim this off with just a trim bit on the router. And then we'll use the spindle sander to contour the outside and get it nice and formed to its shape. And then we'll do more sanding on it after that. Here we're just going to trim the bottoms of these with this router bit here. We're going to continue with more sanding using an orbital sander, starting with 120 grit, then 220, and then finally 320. All right, next we're going to take this pattern off. This is probably going to come off pretty easy because I use some adhesive that's you can reposition the paper with. If you use regular spray adhesive, which I have some that I use, you can get it to come off with something like Goo Gone. You have to let it soak a little bit. And you still need to get the glue off the wood that's left from the paper. So we'll spray this, rub it in a little bit. It doesn't really raise the grain very much, so you don't have to worry about that. It is a little bit oily, but it usually works pretty good getting the adhesive off, and you just have to give it time to work. And it will soak into the paper, and it will come off that way. And I usually just use a cloth rag just to wipe this glue off. We'll just let it sit here for a minute. So just keep wiping it off. And we're going to sand it again anyways, so we'll get the rest of it off that way. This paper just comes off once it's been soaked. You just have to get the gummy residue off. Here we're going to use a 1/8 round off bit. We're going to do the outside edges, both front and back, and the inside edge. We're not going to do the bottom though. All right, we're going to go ahead and sand. Right here, we're going to start with 80 grit just to make it a lot faster. And there will be some burn marks from the router bit. And try to get as much of that off as we can. It doesn't take a lot. If you don't like sanding, then this is not a project for you because there's a lot of sanding involved. Here we're going to start working on our drawer blanks. What I normally do is cut the front off and then the back off. The front I cut off at 3/8 of an inch. The back is usually 1/4 of an inch. It's important to note here how the box is positioned. You want a flat edge on the bottom. If it's rounded and you go to push it into the box drawer, it will kick up on you and can cause some damage to your hands and potentially pull your hand into the blade. So be very careful doing this. Once I get the front and the back cut off of the drawer blank, I put it in the box and mark a line parallel with the base of the box. And then measure up or down depending on how deep I want the drawer and determine how wide I want it. If you get it too wide, you're going to have not enough material at the bottom corners and the drawer box can warp when you go to glue the front and the back onto it. Here we're cutting out the drawer box opening, just according to the lines that we've drawn on the box. What I do is cut down one edge, cut down the other edge, and then go in one edge and then make a curve so I can cut the bottom flat. And you'll have to go back to the side where the curve is initially to get to the bottom and flatten that out as well. So here's my setup for sanding the edges on this opening for the drawer. And it's the best thing that I found. I just have a piece of sandpaper that's looped. You can buy these online for your bandsaw. And I just have a piece of backing wood so it can stay taut as I press against it. All right, here we have our drawer all cut out, and these surfaces are really, really rough from the bandsaw. So I could sand this whole surface off and sand this surface off, but it would decrease a lot of the depth of the drawer. So what I do is just line everything up. And I take a pencil and draw around here. And I just am going to sand this surface in here That way I'm not going to lose any width. I'll do the same thing on the other side. Next, what I do is take a multi-tool with a sanding tip on it, and I sand out the area that I have marked off. My experience with these is you have to keep the speed down really low. Otherwise, you burn up the Velcro underneath the sandpaper, and then the sandpaper won't stick to the attachment anymore. It works well. It doesn't take a whole lot of time, and it makes the inside of the box drawer very smooth around all the edges. Next, I do some hand sanding using 120, 220, and 320 to get the edge of that open area of the box smoother. It makes a big difference in how the box looks and feels, even though it's quite a bit of work. Here we're gluing the drawer pieces together. Be careful you don't use too much glue, otherwise you'll get a lot of squeeze out, and it's a little bit harder to deal with on the inside of the drawer than the outside. The biggest thing here is to make sure that your sides of the drawer box are lined up with the drawer case itself. Make sure you check it well and move things around as you need to. There should be plenty of alignment marks from the bandsaw. Glued together, we need to address these cracks. Sometimes you get a pretty good fit. Other times you get a lot of spacing because of the way the bandsaw blade cut the wood. So I just typically use some wood filler. And sometimes I try to match the color, sometimes I don't. So I just kind of push it in the groove. And we're going to sand this down here once this dries and make this nice and smooth. Now we're going to work on sanding the outside contour of this drawer. And we're just going to use the spindle sander to do that. You have to be careful not to take too much off because it will change the shape too much, and it will make the drawer that much looser in the box case. So let's go ahead and sand this. When using the spindle sander, you have to be aware of the grain of the box because it will grab it suddenly and can actually rip it out of your hands. And you just try to go a little bit at a time when you get in those areas, and you'll eventually get it smooth. Next, we're going to take these patterns off the face of the drawer of the box. I'm just going to use some Goo Gone, let it soak through the paper, and it should peel off after you let it sit and soak through for a minute. And this one just comes right off. If you let it sit long enough and you're patient enough, I don't tend to be that patient, it will come off pretty easily. And we'll just get the residual glue off. Here we're going to round the edges off on the drawer of the box, and then we'll do some final sanding on it. Here we're doing some final sanding on the drawer of the box itself. And again, we're probably using 120, 220, and 320 to get it nice and smooth and get a good finish on it. Next, we need to decide on some handles for the drawers. Now, previously I had cut some handles out of this white ash, and I thought, while I was mixing some colored epoxy for another project, I may as well use the leftovers and fill in these molds here. I just put tape on the back. And so I think I'm gonna use these two handles here. I'll cut these out with a bandsaw and use them on these two apple wood face boxes. And then I'm gonna probably use walnut against this cherry face here. Here I'm using the spindle sander to sand down the profiles of the door handles and get them to the shape and I want. It also helps in smoothing them out a lot. After this, we'll use the orbital sander and then some hand sanding to finish off the door. Here we're going to glue this handle on. And again, you don't want to use too much glue. Otherwise you'll have troubles with the finish being marred by the glue. And again, it doesn't hurt to let it sit just for a minute. With this, I don't use any clamping force. I just figure out where I want it. Let it dry a little bit there. And that's it. Next, I do some hand sanding. I go ahead and use 320s for some final sanding, just to make sure you get all the scratches out from moving things around and make sure everything's nice and smooth before we apply finish. Next, we go ahead and blow off with compressed air all the boxes, just to make sure you get all the sawdust out of the box itself, and so you won't have any problems when you go to apply your finish. Now comes the fun part. To see what your box is really going to look like. I use this little craft brush to get all the corners and all the areas it's hard to get in with a cloth. This is wipe-on poly U that I'm using. The first coat absorbs pretty fast, and I usually do at least 4 coats, sometimes up to 6, just kind of depending on what it is I'm making and how well the wood absorbs it. The more it absorbs, the more layers you have to do. Once your cloth gets saturated, it goes a lot faster. So this is the inside of what it looks like. We're not going to do the back because I'm going to put that down to dry, but we'll do the rest of it. Let's see what it looks like. Now this will dull as it dries, and like I said, I do multiple coats, and I usually sand between coats, at least 320, sometimes 2000 grit. Let's miss a spot. Now let's see what this face piece looks like. This should be nice. I think this blue is going to look good. I'm going to set it down and just kind of finish where my hand was. Here are the bandsaw boxes after one coat. It dries pretty fast. It dulls fairly fast as it's drying. That's why you need multiple coats. I put a total of 4 coats on these particular boxes, and then they look good enough that they were done. What I do is add a few felt pads to the bottom so they won't scratch any furniture, and that completes this project. Here are some pictures of the finished bandsaw boxes. I usually use them as gifts. I put some chocolate in the boxes themselves. That usually goes over pretty well. And I give them away to people that I meet or people that I know. Hope you enjoyed this project, and I hope you try this project. It's fun, and it results in a nice little gift that you can give away. Thank you for watching.